When a narcissistic woman realizes she can't replace you, the first thing that surfaces is not heartbreak, it's panic. And that panic is deeply psychological. For a long time, she functioned by drawing energy from external sources: attention, admiration, emotional reactions. You were not just a person in her life, you were a stabilizing force in her inner world, even if she never acknowledged it consciously. When that source disappears and no suitable replacement appears, the internal structure she relied on begins to weaken. This is where her composure starts to fracture. The confidence you once saw was never self-generated, it was borrowed. Without someone to mirror her importance back to her, she is forced into an unfamiliar confrontation with emptiness. Not loneliness in the ordinary sense, but a more unsettling void, the absence of identity. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when the persona collapses, and what lies beneath is not strength, but dependency and fear. She may distract herself, rush connections, or exaggerate her independence, but underneath those behaviors is urgency. The nervous system is activated, control is slipping, and for someone who survives by controlling perception, both her own and others, this loss feels existential. She is no longer choosing, she is scrambling. What exposes her true nature is not anger or revenge, but the quiet realization that she cannot recreate what she lost, because what she lost was not interchangeable. This moment is significant, not because it redeems her, but because it reveals something essential to you. Your value was real, not imagined. You were not replaceable because you were not a role, you were a presence. And once you understand that, the question is no longer why she panics, but why you would ever return to being someone else's source instead of your own. When she realizes she can't replace you, the second fracture happens quietly, but far more deeply. Her ego takes a blow she never prepared for. Not the kind that provokes immediate drama, but the kind that destabilizes her internal hierarchy. Narcissistic structure depends on a core belief. For I am exceptional, therefore people are interchangeable. You were supposed to be proof of that belief. When you turn out not to be replaceable, the belief collapses. What wounds her is not loss in the emotional sense, it's contradiction. Your absence challenges the story she tells herself about who she is. If you were truly insignificant, someone else should have filled the space effortlessly. When that doesn't happen, doubt creeps in, not as humility, but as narcissistic injury. This is why her reaction often looks disproportionate. The ego isn't bruised, it's exposed. In psychological terms, the ego here is brittle. It relies on constant reinforcement to maintain its illusion of superiority. You once played that role without realizing it, through patience, empathy, consistency, or emotional depth. When you step away and refuse to be reabsorbed, the mirror disappears. And without that mirror, she cannot stabilize her self-image. This is also why you may sense resentment rather than sadness. Your continued absence becomes a reminder that her power has limits. She may rewrite history, diminish your importance, or inflate her own value publicly, but those are compensations, not truths. The ego is trying to repair itself without doing the one thing required: self-examination. What matters here is not her reaction, but your clarity. If your presence was strong enough to unsettle an inflated ego once it was gone, then you were never small. You were simply misplaced. And the real task now is not to be understood by her, but to finally understand yourself well enough to never offer that power away again. After the ego is wounded, something curious often happens. The indifference you once saw begins to dissolve, and in its place appears a strange intensity, attention that arrives late, curiosity that feels intrusive, concern that sounds rehearsed. This is not love returning. It is control attempting to reassert itself. When a narcissistic woman can no longer replace you, the mind does not simply let go. It circles back, trying to reclaim what escaped its grasp. Psychologically, this is the moment where absence becomes intolerable. As long as you were present, even distant, she could regulate herself through your availability. Once you are truly gone, emotionally, energetically, psychologically, you transform into something dangerous, an unanswered question. And for someone who needs certainty to maintain superiority, uncertainty becomes obsession. This is why behaviors may escalate. Watching from a distance, indirect messages, sudden warmth, or even hostility, all are attempts to provoke a response. Not because she suddenly understands your value in a mature sense, but because your silence denies her feedback. In Jungian language, the shadow has been activated. What she disowned, dependence, insecurity, need, now pushes forward, demanding recognition. What's important to understand is that this attention is not about connection, it's about resolution. She is trying to close a psychological loop without confronting the truth that you left by choice, not by weakness. And the more grounded you remain, the more destabilizing that truth becomes for her. For you, this phase can feel confusing. The sudden focus may tempt you to reinterpret the past. But clarity lies in timing. Interest that emerges only after access is denied is not intimacy, it's ego repair. And when you recognize that, you gain something far more valuable than validation: freedom. Because the moment you stop reacting is the moment her obsession loses its object. And you finally step out of a story that was never written for your growth, but now ends because you chose to grow anyway. At this stage, when replacement has failed and control cannot be re-established, the psyche moves into defense. Rage, blame, and victimhood begin to surface, not always loudly, but consistently. From a psychological perspective, this is not cruelty for its own sake, it is protection. The narcissistic structure cannot tolerate responsibility because responsibility would require self-confrontation. And self-confrontation threatens the fragile image she must preserve at all costs. So the narrative shifts. Suddenly, you are redefined. Your boundaries become cruelty. Your silence becomes abandonment. Your clarity becomes betrayal. This is projection in its purest form, an unconscious attempt to relocate internal shame onto an external target. As Carl Jung observed, what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, we encounter as fate in others. You become the container for everything she cannot face within. Victimhood is especially seductive here because it allows her to reclaim moral superiority without changing anything internally. If she is the one who was harmed, then she does not have to examine how she harmed. If she is misunderstood, then she does not have to understand herself. This is why smear campaigns or subtle character distortions may emerge. They are not about truth. They are about stabilizing an identity that is beginning to crack. For you, this phase can feel unjust. There is a temptation to defend yourself to correct the story, to be seen accurately. But engaging only feeds the mechanism. Every explanation gives her something to push against. Silence, by contrast, leaves projection nowhere to land. And here is the deeper insight. When someone must destroy your image to survive psychologically, it is because your presence threatened an illusion they could no longer maintain. You are not required to correct the narrative of someone committed to misunderstanding you. Your task is simpler and far more powerful. To step out of the role entirely and let truth stand without your defense. After rage and blame have run their course, something subtler often appears, a performance of growth. On the surface, it can look convincing: new confidence, curated happiness, sudden spirituality, or declarations of self, love, and healing. But psychologically, this phase is not transformation, it is adaptation. The narcissistic psyche is highly skilled at imitation. It learns the language of insight without submitting to the discipline of insight itself. What you are witnessing here is not inner work, but image repair. The external self is adjusted, so the internal structure doesn't have to be questioned. From a Jungian perspective, this is the persona evolving while the shadow remains untouched. Carl Jung warned that the most dangerous illusion is believing consciousness has expanded simply because the vocabulary has improved. True growth is uncomfortable, quiet, and destabilizing. What you see instead is polished and immediate. This false growth serves several purposes. It reassures her that she is still admirable. It signals to the world that she is winning. And most importantly, it avoids grief. Because to genuinely heal, she would have to mourn not just the loss of you, but the loss of the fantasy that she was always in control. Mourning requires humility, and humility threatens the very foundation of narcissistic identity. For you, this phase can be disorienting. You may wonder if you misjudged her, if she really has changed, if you were simply a catalyst. But timing reveals truth. Growth that emerges only after supply is lost and is displayed primarily to be seen is not integration. It is compensation. The deeper insight is this: authentic change does not need an audience, and it does not need to announce itself. When you stop measuring her apparent evolution and start honoring your own hard-earned clarity, the illusion loses its power. And that is the real marker of progress, not her ability to appear healed, but your ability to no longer be impressed by appearances that once kept you bound. What ultimately brings this entire cycle to its conclusion is not confrontation, explanation, or even closure, but silence. Not the passive kind rooted in fear, but the deliberate silence that comes from self-possession. When you withdraw your energy without hostility or justification, something profound happens. You stop participating in her psychological economy. And for someone who survives on reaction, this absence is destabilizing. From a depth psychology perspective, silence functions like a mirror that cannot be manipulated. There is nothing to argue with, nothing to distort, nothing to dominate. Your calm non-engagement forces her inward, toward the very territory she has spent a lifetime avoiding. As Carl Jung understood, when outer distractions fall away, the unconscious demands to be reckoned with. And this is precisely what makes your silence so powerful. It removes the external object she used to regulate herself. This is why silence is often met with escalation at first. Provocations increase, narratives intensify, emotions spike. But eventually, without reinforcement, the behavior collapses. Not because she suddenly understands you, but because there is nothing left to extract. The system shuts down when it can no longer feed. For you, silence marks a psychological graduation. It means you no longer need to be seen, validated, or corrected by someone who could never truly see you. It means your sense of self is no longer organized around reaction, but around intention. This is not avoidance, it is integration. You are no longer defined by what you endured, but by what you refuse to carry forward. And here is the final truth to sit with. When your absence becomes someone else's greatest discomfort, it is because your presence once held them together. The power was never in confrontation, it was always in your ability to walk away whole. And once you understand that, silence is no longer something you do, it is simply who you have become.